I need to come in and take a quick look around. Step back.
Do you have a warrant?
I'm conducting an investigation. I have reasonable suspicion.
Reasonable suspicion is not a key to my house. Do you have a warrant, consent, or an emergency?
Innocent people cooperate. You refusing makes you look suspicious.
Refusal is not suspicion. It's a right. Are you asking for consent or giving a lawful order? State the legal
I'm not
basis.
playing word games.
Police overreach keeps happening because some officers think pressure can replace the law. That's what Officer Brett Tanner tried at a private home one evening. He showed up, demanded entry, and acted like the resident had no real choice. He was wrong. The man at the door knew the law, stayed calm, and forced Tanner into a mistake that would later blow up his career. Tanner still had no idea the resident was Privacy Commissioner Elias Rowan. Comment where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about civil rights, police abuse, and real accountability, like the video and subscribe. Tanner was sent to the house on a suspicious activity call. The report was weak. No violence, no emergency, no crime clearly in progress. Elias Rowan opened the door. Tanner immediately said he needed to come inside and look around. Rowan asked if he had a warrant. Tanner said he was conducting an investigation. That was the first red flag. He didn't answer the question because the answer was no. He had no warrant. He just expected the badge and tone to carry him through the door. Rowan asked again, did Tanner have a signed warrant authorizing entry into the house? Tanner changed the wording and said he had reasonable suspicion. That was false. Reasonable suspicion does not allow an officer to enter a private residence. It doesn't replace a warrant. Tanner was either bluffing or didn't know the limit of his own authority. Rowan didn't reveal who he was. He let Tanner keep talking. He asked whether there was an emergency inside the home. Tanner gave no clear answer. Rowan asked whether anyone inside was in immediate danger. No answer. He asked whether Tanner had seen a crime from outside the property. Again, nothing solid. That exposed the whole move. Tanner wanted entry first and justification later. Then came the usual pressure. He said innocent people cooperate. He implied refusal made Rowan look suspicious. He said he only needed a quick look. Rowan answered with the law. He said entry into a private residence requires a warrant, consent, or an actual emergency. None of those existed. Tanner kept pushing. He brought up officer safety and said he needed to secure the scene. Same tactic, different wording. Rowan asked a direct question. Was Tanner giving a lawful order based on specific legal authority? Or was he asking for consent to enter? Tanner couldn't answer it cleanly. If it was consent, Rowan could refuse. If it was a lawful order, Tanner had to name the legal basis. He didn't either. He just repeated that he needed to get inside and said Rowan was making things harder. That's what officers do when they don't have legal footing. They try to make the person asserting rights sound like the problem. The scene itself made Tanner look worse. Quiet residential street, no signs of distress, no emergency, no reason for forced entry. The front of the house was covered by security cameras, and Tanner's body camera was running. A neighbor had started watching. A delivery driver slowed down near the curb. Tanner still kept pressing. Rowan asked for his badge number. Tanner gave it. Then Rowan asked him to state on camera what legal standard allowed entry into a private home without a warrant. Tanner said reasonable suspicion again. That was a serious mistake. Now the false claim was on video. Rowan said there would be no consent to enter and no consent to search. Tanner reacted by putting his hand on the door and pushing it wider. Then he moved a foot toward the threshold, as if he were about to step in. That changed the case. This was no longer just verbal pressure. It was an attempted unlawful entry. Rowan stopped him immediately. He told Tanner to remove his hand from the door and keep his foot outside. He stated clearly that no consent had been given and that any attempt to enter would be unlawful. Tanner hesitated. He tried to go back to the vague complaint. Suspicious activity, need to verify. Neighborhood concern. None of it answered the basic question. Rowan asked him one last time, What emergency justified entry into the house? Tanner had no answer. That was when the power shifted. Tanner still had the uniform, but the bluff was finished. He had made false legal claims on camera and tried to push into a private home without a warrant. Rowan let him finish talking. Then he decided Tanner needed to know exactly whose door he was standing at. Rowan told Tanner he was going to make this very simple for him. He said the officer was standing at the home of Elias Rowan, the current privacy commissioner, and that every second of this contact was being recorded for formal review. He also said Tanner had just tried to enter a private residence without a warrant, without consent, and without any emergency that could justify it. That landed immediately. Tanner's whole posture changed, not because he suddenly respected the law, because he understood the risk. A minute earlier, he was still trying to dominate the scene. Now he was trying to figure out how much damage he had already done. He asked Rowan to repeat his name. Rowan did. Then he identified his office in full. That was the break in the scene. Tanner stopped talking over him. He stopped pushing the doorway. He pulled his hand back. He stepped off the threshold. Too late to undo anything, but early enough to show he finally understood this wasn't an ordinary resident. Rowan didn't let him regain control of the exchange. He laid it out in order. Tanner had demanded entry without a warrant. He had used reasonable suspicion as if it authorized a residential search. It did not. He had tried to pressure consent by implying refusal created suspicion. He had then placed a hand on the door and moved into the entry line without lawful authority. Every part of that sequence was now preserved on camera. Tanner tried to shrink the incident. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said he was only trying to verify a complaint. He said he had not entered the home. That was weak, and Rowan treated it that way. He said attempted unlawful entry did not become lawful because the resident stopped it in time. He said coercion did not become consent because the officer failed to complete the search. He said the issue was not whether Tanner had managed to get fully inside. The issue was that he had no lawful basis to try. That's the part bad officers hate. Precision, no yelling, no chaos. Just a clean record and a person who knows exactly how to describe the misconduct. Tanner then tried the fallback move. He asked if they could reset the conversation and handle the matter informally. Rowan refused that immediately. He said the matter had already moved past informal handling the moment Tanner asserted false authority and attempted to cross the threshold. Then he asked whether Tanner intended to call a supervisor himself or whether Rowan should request one through dispatch while the recording continued. Tanner paused again. He knew what either option meant. A supervisor arriving on scene would hear the legal issue while the body camera was still running. Dispatch records would pin the timeline down even further. There was no clean exit left. He called for a supervisor. That was the first correct decision he made at the house. While they waited, Rowan kept him pinned to facts. He asked whether dispatch had sent him on a report of violence. No. He asked whether dispatch had reported any imminent threat inside the home. No. He asked whether Tanner had observed anything from outside the property that could support immediate entry. No clear answer. Rowan asked him one more time to state whether he had relied on reasonable suspicion as grounds to enter the home. Tanner didn't want to repeat it now. He said he had been assessing the situation. That answer only made him look worse. A few minutes later, Sergeant Nina Holloway arrived. She stepped out of her car expecting a routine friction call between an officer and a resident. She walked into something much more serious. Tanner started trying to explain first. That was another mistake. Officers who know they're in trouble usually rush to frame the story before anyone else speaks. Holloway listened for a few seconds. Rowan cut in and identified himself. That changed her face immediately. She didn't become deferential. She became careful. Big difference. She understood at once that this was now a legal exposure issue for the department, not just a field supervision issue. She asked Rowan to explain what had happened from the beginning. He gave her the short version. Tanner demanded entry without a warrant. He claimed reasonable suspicion authorized it. He used pressure to force consent. He put his hand on the door and moved towards the threshold. The property cameras captured it. Tanner's body camera captured it. A neighbor and a driver had also witnessed part of the exchange. Holloway turned to Tanner and asked one direct question. Did he tell the resident that reasonable suspicion allowed him to enter the home? Tanner tried to soften it. He said he may have referred to investigative authority in the course of the contact. That answer did not help him. Holloway asked again, more directly this time. Did he or did he not say, reasonable suspicion justified entry? Tanner admitted he had said it. That was the point where the scene stopped being about judgment and became about evidence. Rowan then explained the problem in terms Holloway could not ignore. A home gets the highest level of protection. Entry requires a warrant, consent, or a recognized emergency exception. None existed here. Tanner had no warrant. He had no victim inside, no sounds of distress, no active pursuit, no visible crime, and no lawful basis to force access. He had relied on a false legal standard, then tried to convert pressure into compliance. That was not confusion. That was overreach. Holloway knew he was right. She also knew this had likely just become an internal affairs case before the officer even left the property. Tanner made one more bad move. He tried to suggest Rowan's refusal to cooperate had escalated the contact. Rowan shut that down fast. He said a citizen's refusal to waive constitutional protection is not escalation. It is the exercise of a right. The officer's decision to ignore that right was the escalation. That answer ended the argument right there. Holloway told Tanner to stop speaking. Then she apologized to Rowan, but Rowan didn't let the conversation drift into polite damage control. He said he was not interested in a porch apology. He wanted the names of every officer assigned to the call, confirmation that body camera footage would be preserved, confirmation that dispatch audio would be retained, and confirmation that the matter would be referred for formal review before the end of shift. That's how someone with actual institutional knowledge handles misconduct. No speeches, no emotional back and forth. Lock the record, preserve the evidence, remove room for editing later. Holloway agreed. She gave her name and badge number. She said the footage would be flagged and preserved. She also said the call log and dispatch notes would be attached to the report. Rowan then made it worse for Tanner because he was still not done. He informed Holloway that Tanner's conduct raised not only constitutional issues, but also privacy governance concerns. An officer who casually claims authority to enter a private residence without legal basis is not just making a bad arrest decision. He is showing disregard for the boundary the law protects most. That becomes a training issue, a supervision issue, and a public trust issue all at once. That was the moment Tanner understood this was not heading toward a warning memo or a quiet correction. This would move. Fast. He tried one last time to speak directly to Rowan. He said he had no intention of violating anyone's rights. Rowan answered that intention was not the standard. Conduct was. That line finished him. Holloway directed Tanner back toward the sidewalk and away from the door. She then asked Rowan whether he intended to file a formal complaint. He said yes, and he said it would include unlawful attempted entry, coercive consent tactics, false statements of legal authority, and failure to articulate any emergency basis for bypassing the warrant requirement. Holloway didn't argue. She couldn't. Before ending the contact, Rowan gave one final statement for the record. He said rights do not depend on whether an officer feels inconvenienced by them. That was the entire case in one sentence. Tanner had shown up expecting an easy display of authority. He left the porch under supervision on camera after being corrected on the law at the home of the privacy commissioner himself. And the real damage was only starting. Rowan filed the complaint that same night. He didn't leave room for interpretation. He listed the sequence in order, attached the timestamps from the exterior security system, identified the attempted threshold entry, and described the exact legal claim Tanner had made on camera. He also requested preservation of all related material, body camera footage, dispatch audio, patrol car video, call notes, and supervisor communications. That mattered. Fast complaints with specific evidence are hard to bury. By the next morning, the case had already moved beyond a normal citizen complaint. Tanner had not just handled a call badly. He had asserted authority he did not have, used the wrong legal standard to demand access to a home, and done it in front of a resident whose job was built around privacy law and institutional compliance. Internal Affairs opened a review almost immediately. The first problem for Tanner was the video. His body camera matched Rowan's exterior footage. The sequence was clean. Tanner demanded entry. Rowan asked for a warrant. Tanner avoided the answer. Tanner relied on reasonable suspicion. Rowan asked whether there was an emergency. Tanner could not name one. Then came the pressure tactics. Refusal means suspicion. Quick look. Don't make this harder. Then the door. Hand on it. Push. Foot toward the threshold. There was no mystery in the footage. That's what made it bad. The second problem was dispatch. The original call did not support what Tanner tried to do at the house. It was a weak suspicious activity report with no violence, no emergency, and no instruction suggesting immediate danger inside the property. That destroyed any later attempt to claim he had responded to a crisis. Then, the witness statements came in. The neighbor across the street said she heard Tanner raising his voice and talking like he had the right to go inside. The delivery driver confirmed he saw the officer pressing the interaction and standing too close to the doorway. Neither witness could describe every legal detail, but they didn't need to. They supported the central point. Tanner was the one escalating the scene. Sergeant Nina Holloway's report didn't save him either. She documented that when she arrived, Rowan identified the false legal standard immediately, described the attempted entry clearly, and requested preservation of evidence on the spot. She also documented that Tanner admitted he had referred to reasonable suspicion as grounds for entry. Once that went into a supervisory report, his options got even smaller. Then Internal Affairs checked Tanner's history. That's where the case got worse. There had been prior complaints, not identical, but close enough to show a pattern. 2 earlier contacts had involved allegations that Tanner pressured residents during consent searches. One complaint said he implied refusal would create legal trouble. Another said he treated basic questions about warrants as non-cooperation. Those cases had not ended his career, but they now looked very different when placed next to the Rowan footage. That's how career-ending files get built. Not from one bad clip alone. From one bad clip that suddenly makes the old complaints make sense. The department's legal office got involved before the first week was over. They understood the exposure. If Rowan wanted to litigate, the city was in a weak position. The facts were terrible. The recording was clear. The officer had used the wrong legal theory on camera. And the target of the misconduct was a national privacy official with the knowledge and credibility to explain every violation in public if necessary. That changed the department's tone fast. Tanner was pulled from patrol pending investigation. His access to independent fieldwork was suspended. He was ordered to submit a supplemental report explaining the legal basis for his attempted entry. That report hurt him even more. He tried to clean up the language. He stopped saying reasonable suspicion authorized entry and started using vague phrases about evolving safety assessment and investigative necessity. That might have worked in a case without footage. Here, it only made him look dishonest. Internal reviewers could compare the report to the video and see the gap immediately. That's a bad place for any officer. The original conduct is one problem. A paper trail that looks cleaned up after the fact is another. Rowan did not let the matter drift into internal silence. He kept it formal and public-facing at the same time. He notified the relevant oversight office, submitted a separate privacy governance memorandum on the misuse of legal authority during home contacts, and requested a policy review on consent search training. He was not just building a complaint against Tanner, he was building a record against the system that trained him. That widened the damage. Local reporters got hold of the story within days, not the full footage at first, just the outline. Patrol officer demands entry into private home without warrant. Resident turns out to be privacy commissioner. Department opens internal investigation. That was enough. Once the existence of video became known, the story spread quickly. And it spread for a simple reason. People recognized the pattern. A lot of residents had their own version of the story. An officer talks like he already has the right. A citizen gets pressured into cooperating. The line between request and command gets blurred on purpose. Most cases never become national examples because the resident doesn't have cameras, legal knowledge, or a title that forces institutions to pay attention. This one had all three. That's why the public response hit hard. Civil liberties groups called it a textbook unlawful entry attempt. Former prosecutors said Tanner's legal reasoning made no sense. Retired judges speaking generally about search law pointed out the same thing Rowan had said at the door. A home is not searchable because an officer feels suspicious. The threshold matters. The warrant requirement matters. Consent has to be real. Pressure does not make it real. Inside the department, the case was turning toxic. Command staff now had two problems: the footage itself, and the fact that Tanner might not be an isolated problem. If one patrol officer was this comfortable inventing authority at someone's front door, supervisors had to answer the next question. How often had that tactic worked on people who did not know better? That question scared them more than Tanner did. By the second week, investigators had enough to move from review to recommendation. The findings were shaping up around 4 points: false statement of legal authority, attempted unlawful residential entry, coercive consent tactics, and inaccurate post-incident reporting. Any one of those could lead to major discipline. Together, they put termination on the table. Tanner started looking for a way out. He reportedly told colleagues the situation had been blown out of proportion because of who Rowan was. That argument went nowhere. Rowan's title had not created the misconduct. It had only prevented it from being buried. That's an important difference. If Tanner had done the same thing to a teacher, a mechanic, a nurse, or an elderly homeowner with no camera system, he might have walked away from it. That was the real scandal underneath the scandal, and everyone could see it now. By the end of the second week, the department had the footage, the reports, the witness statements, the dispatch logs, and the prior complaints lined up in one file. At that point, Tanner's problem was no longer the front porch. It was the fact that the whole record told the same story. The investigation ended Tanner's career. Internal Affairs found that he had no legal basis to enter the home, used false legal authority, tried to pressure consent, and then changed his wording in the report after the fact. The video made all of it easy to prove. He demanded entry, claimed reasonable suspicion allowed it, failed to identify any emergency, and then put his hand on the door and moved toward the threshold. The department fired him. Then the State Certification Board opened its own review. That mattered almost as much as the firing. Losing one job is one thing. Losing certification means other departments see the same record and the same risk. That's how a career really ends. Rowan kept the case focused on law and procedure. He made it clear this was not about personal status. It was about an officer trying to replace legal authority with pressure at the door of a private home. The fallout didn't stop with Tanner. The department had to review training, rewrite parts of its consent search guidance, and tighten rules for home entry contacts. Officers were retrained on the basic standards they should already have known. A home requires a warrant, valid consent, or an actual emergency. Suspicion alone is not enough. That was the real impact of the case. Tanner lost his job, but the bigger issue was exposed too. If Rowan had not known the law and had not had cameras, Tanner might have gotten away with it. That's the lesson. A badge does not erase civil rights. A demand is not the same as lawful authority. And the people who get away with overreach usually stop only when someone knows the law and forces the record to speak for itself. Tell me what you would have done in that situation. share the story with someone who needs to know their rights, and subscribe for more stories like this.
Hands up! Don't try to run away!
Sir, why? You want to suspect me even if I stop the real danger?
Turn around. Now. Should have dropped the gun sooner.
You got the wrong guy. He saved us.
Back up or you're leaving in cuffs too.
A local officer thought he was taking down a dangerous vigilante, but he was actually arresting the nation's deadliest asset. After neutralizing an active shooter, this veteran found himself in handcuffs instead of being thanked. Watch as the officer's ego shattered when he realized he had just detained an active Delta Force operator. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you like stories where discipline beats ego and the truth catches up fast, hit like and subscribe. What made this one different wasn't just the bad arrest. It was the timing. The wrong man got treated like the threat less than a minute after he stopped one. By the time Officer Ryan Miller ran into the front lane of the Brookside Market Plaza, the shooting was already over. People were still screaming. Some were crouched behind cars. Some had their phones out. One man was on the ground near the pharmacy entrance, motionless, with a rifle a few feet away. Another man stood about 10 yards from him, breathing hard, holding a handgun low, not waving it, not running, not saying much. He looked like he was waiting for police to decide whether they were going to do their job right or ruin his day. Miller didn't slow down long enough to read the scene. He saw the gun. He saw the man holding it. That was enough for him. He came in loud, full command voice, weapon up, already locked onto the wrong conclusion. Witnesses started pointing and shouting over each other. More than one of them tried to tell him the same thing. The man with the handgun had stopped the shooter. The downed suspect was the one who opened fire. The armed man had pulled people behind cover before he engaged. He had likely saved half a dozen lives in under 15 seconds. Miller ignored all of it. That was the first real problem. Not confusion, not stress. Tunnel vision mixed with ego. The man with the handgun was Elias Vance, late 30s. Plain dark t-shirt, jeans, ball cap, nothing flashy. No military haircut cliché, no look at me energy. He looked like somebody who knew how to stay unnoticed. He had been inside the market, buying electrolyte packets and protein bars, when the shooter entered through the side doors and started firing toward the checkout area. Elias moved faster than anyone else because he understood what was happening before most people did. He got two civilians behind a freezer end cap, closed distance when the shooter shifted attention, and stopped him with controlled fire. Then he scanned, checked hands, checked angles, and held position until sirens got close. That part was clean. Then Miller arrived and made it dirty. Elias followed commands. That mattered. He lowered the handgun. He set it on the pavement when ordered. He kept his hands visible. He told Miller calmly that he was the one who stopped the shooter. He also told him there were witnesses everywhere and cameras on the storefront. Miller treated that like attitude. He rushed him, drove him against the side of the patrol SUV, and cuffed him hard enough that people around them reacted immediately. One woman shouted that the officer had the wrong guy. A teenage kid who had been live streaming from behind a planter kept saying it too, louder each time, because now the whole thing was on video, and there was no confusion left for anyone watching. Miller snapped at the crowd to back up and stop interfering. That's usually how bad scenes get worse. The moment an officer starts fighting the witnesses instead of using them. Elias didn't resist. That's another detail that mattered later. He didn't yank away, didn't square up, didn't start barking credentials. He kept it measured. He told Miller the cuffs were too tight, told him he had complied from the start, and told him again that the suspect was down by the entrance. Miller wasn't listening for facts. He was listening for control. He started asking the kind of questions that made it obvious he had already built his own version of events. Why did Elias have a gun? Why was he still standing over the body? Why didn't he drop sooner? Why was he giving orders like he ran the scene? The answers were simple. He was legally armed. He had just stopped a mass casualty event. He dropped the weapon when ordered. He was giving concise information because Miller needed it. Didn't matter. Miller shoved him forward again and began a more aggressive search than scene safety required. A quick protective pat-down would have been one thing. That's not what this was. He went through pockets, dug into waistband areas after the weapon was already secured, pulled out wallet, keys, folded receipts, and a slim card sleeve that looked more tactical than civilian. He spread everything on the hood like he was proving a point. Elias warned him calmly that he needed to be careful with what he was handling. Miller took that the wrong way, too. People like Miller hate calm when they're trying to dominate somebody. Calm makes them feel stupid. He asked if Elias thought being military meant local cops couldn't touch him. He said it in that mocking tone officers use when they want bystanders to see contempt instead of judgment. He noticed part of a federal identification card, saw a service-related credential, then decided he had found the thing he could use to shrink the man in front of him. So he started talking about soldiers who came home and thought they were above the law. That line changed the energy around the scene. A nurse who had taken cover behind a concrete pillar had watched the whole shooting from the moment it started. She told another officer coming in that Miller was way off. A store manager said the same. The kid live streaming got close enough to capture Miller's hands going through Elias's wallet, while people in the comment feed started asking the obvious question. Why was the cop searching the guy witnesses were calling the hero? That's the thing about modern scenes. Departments can pretend later. Phones don't. A body camera catches one angle. Store cameras catch another. Live streams fill in the rest. Once enough people record the same bad decision, a career starts cracking before anyone gets back to the station. Miller didn't know it yet, but he was already done. He just hadn't reached the part where everyone else could see it. Elias kept his tone even. He told Miller there were legal limits to what he was doing and that this would all be reviewed. Not as a threat, just a fact. He sounded like a man who understood process, knew oversight, knew what evidence looked like when somebody in authority got reckless. Miller responded by tightening one cuff another notch. Small move, mean move. The kind that says more than a whole report ever can. He then picked through the card sleeve again. There was a state carry permit, a driver's license, another credential tucked behind a plain divider, dark finish, federal seal, not standard military retiree ID, not veteran status, not something patrol usually sees on a random plaza call. He paused. That was the first honest pause he'd had since arriving. He pulled the card halfway out and looked at it more closely. The name matched the license. Elias Vance. The photo matched. The agency markings made him frown. He turned it over like maybe the second look would simplify it. It didn't. He asked Elias what exactly this was. Elias answered in the same controlled voice he'd used the whole time. He told him it was a government identification and told him, again, that he was making the situation worse by handling things he didn't understand in the middle of an active scene. That answer should have made a smart officer stop and call a supervisor. Miller called dispatch instead, but not because he suddenly got careful. He called because now he was irritated and confused at the same time, which is a dangerous combination in somebody already operating on ego. He read the identifying numbers off the credential. Dispatch asked him to repeat them. He did. Then there was a break in the radio traffic. A weird one. Not long. Just long enough to feel different. Around them, more units were arriving. Officers started pushing civilians back, taping off the storefront, checking the downed shooter, clearing the market. A paramedic team moved in. The plaza had shifted from panic to procedure. But right at Miller's patrol SUV, the real story was tightening. He looked at Elias again, but differently this time. Not respectful yet, just less certain. That's usually how it starts when somebody realizes the person in cuffs may not be the one about to lose everything. Dispatch came back with a voice that had lost its casual rhythm. They told Miller to hold the scene, not touch anything else belonging to the detainee, and wait for a supervisor immediately. He asked why. Dispatch didn't answer the question cleanly. That was answer enough. Then came the second transmission. More careful, more formal. Verification in progress. Department of Defense credential valid. Active duty status indicated. Additional notification pending. Supervisor en route. Do not proceed further without command authorization. That hit Miller harder than it should have, because by then he already knew this wasn't some reserve ID or contractor badge. He looked down at the cuffed man, at the calm face, at the complete lack of panic. And for the first time since he arrived, Officer Miller looked like he understood he had stepped into something bigger than him. The next radio response changed the scene. Dispatch told Officer Miller the credential was valid. The man in cuffs was active duty military, special operations. Then dispatch told him to stop searching, stop questioning, and wait for a supervisor. Miller asked for clarification. He got it. Dispatch confirmed that Elias Vance was attached to Delta Force and currently on authorized leave. They told Miller not to discuss details over the air and to hold the scene for command staff. That was the moment Miller understood he had created a serious problem. Until then, he had acted like he controlled the scene. Now he looked unsure. He stopped talking the way he had been talking. He stopped moving the way he had been moving. He looked at Elias again, this time like he was trying to figure out how bad this was going to get. Elias stayed calm. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to embarrass Miller in front of the crowd. He stood there in cuffs and let the officer sit in the result of his own decisions. Around them, the rest of the plaza was being processed. Officers cleared the storefronts. Medics moved in. Witnesses were separated. The downed shooter was checked and secured. But near Miller's patrol SUV, the attention had shifted. People had seen enough to know what happened. Several witnesses had already told responding officers that Elias was the one who stopped the shooter. The teenage boy who had been live streaming never lowered his phone. The ER nurse near the entrance repeated that Elias had pulled civilians to cover and engaged only after the shooter opened fire. The store manager gave the same account. Those statements matched each other. They also matched the security camera angles from the market entrance. Miller had ignored all of that. Sergeant Dana Ruiz arrived within minutes. She stepped out, took one look at the scene, and went straight to the problem. Elias was cuffed beside the SUV. His wallet and personal items were spread across the hood. Miller was standing there with none of the confidence he had a minute earlier. Witnesses were still upset and pointing in his direction. Ruiz got a fast summary from dispatch. Then she asked Elias if he was injured. He told her the cuffs were too tight, and that Miller had gone beyond what was necessary during the search. Ruiz uncuffed him immediately. She told another officer to photograph the marks on his wrists. She ordered Miller to step back. Then she apologized to Elias in direct terms and said his belongings would be returned and logged correctly. Miller tried to explain himself. He started with the weapon. Then he mentioned officer safety and the confusion of an active shooter scene. Ruiz cut that off and asked one question. Had witnesses already told him Elias was the man who stopped the shooter before he put him in cuffs? Miller gave a weak answer. That was enough. Ruiz reassigned him away from the center of the scene and ordered all footage preserved. Bodycam, dashcam, store video, civilian recordings if officers could collect copies before people left. She understood what this had become. The shooting itself was one investigation. Miller's conduct was now another. Elias kept his focus on the record. He told Ruiz he would give a statement. He also told her he wanted every witness identified, every recording preserved, and every item taken from him documented in order. He was very clear. He wanted the facts locked down before anyone tried to soften the timeline later. That got everyone's attention. A short time later, 2 federal representatives arrived in an unmarked SUV. They spoke first with Ruiz, then with Elias. No scene, no speeches. They were there because a local officer had unlawfully detained an active-duty special operations operator right after he stopped a mass shooting. That alone was bad enough. The facts around the shooting made it worse for Miller. Investigators confirmed that the shooter had entered through the side entrance with a rifle and opened fire toward the checkout lanes. 3 civilians had already been hit before Elias intervened. Witnesses said Elias moved people behind cover, engaged the shooter when he had a clear shot, and stopped the attack before more people were hit. After that, he held position until police arrived. That part was consistent across witness statements and video. Then Miller arrived and treated the person who stopped the attack like the suspect. By that evening, the live stream clip was all over local social media. Then larger accounts picked it up. The video showed witnesses yelling that Elias had saved people, while Miller shoved him against the patrol SUV and searched through his wallet. Another clip showed Miller tightening the cuffs after Elias warned him to respect legal limits. That footage did real damage because it removed the usual excuses. The issue was not that Miller approached a man with a gun cautiously. The issue was what he did after multiple witnesses identified Elias as the one who stopped the shooter. He kept escalating. He ignored clear information. He searched deeper than necessary. He mocked the man's service. He changed his tone only after dispatch confirmed who he had detained. The department could not explain that away. An internal review started immediately. Then it widened. Bodycam footage showed that witnesses tried to correct Miller early. Store video confirmed Elias had not threatened officers and had complied with commands. Reports from the scene showed that Miller continued treating Elias as the primary threat after the actual shooter was already down and identifiable. Then investigators looked backward. They found older complaints against Miller that followed the same pattern: fast escalation, weak fact-checking, aggressive behavior when challenged. Several of those complaints had been closed without major discipline. After Brookside, those older cases were reviewed again. That created a second problem for the department. It was no longer just about one officer making one bad call. It raised the question of why warning signs had not been taken seriously earlier. Elias did not accept a quiet apology and move on. Through counsel, he asked for a full preservation order, a review of Miller's complaint history, and a formal examination of the detention, search, and use of restraints. He wanted the department to address the pattern, not just the embarrassment of this one case. That forced the issue. Miller was suspended. Then he was removed from duty pending the full investigation. The findings got worse as more evidence came in. Supervisors noted that he had ignored exculpatory witness statements, mishandled personal identification, and used restraints in a way that appeared punitive rather than necessary. The federal side stayed focused on the credential issue and the unlawful detention. City officials focused on civil exposure and public fallout. Department leadership focused on the video because the public could now see exactly what had happened with their own eyes. Miller tried to defend himself by saying he made a quick judgment in a chaotic scene. That argument failed because the timeline was clear. He had a reason to approach carefully. He did not have a reason to keep doubling down after the facts were available. The evidence showed the difference. He resigned before the disciplinary process fully finished. That did not protect him. The state decertification board reviewed the case and permanently revoked his law enforcement certification. He could not move to another department and start over. The city later settled claims tied to the detention and rights violations. Policy changes followed. Officers responding to major scenes received updated training on witness handling, temporary detention limits, and searches once the immediate threat is over. Supervisors were required to review cases more aggressively when video showed officers ignoring clear exculpatory information. Elias never tried to turn the incident into public fame. He gave a formal statement, kept it brief, and returned to his unit. He said the issue was not confusion in a dangerous moment. The issue was an officer refusing to correct himself once the facts were in front of him. That was the cleanest summary of the whole case. One man had real training, real pressure, and real reason to act fast. He stayed controlled. The other had authority, a badge, and witness information handed to him in real time. He let ego lead. That's why this story mattered. The reveal that Elias was Delta Force made headlines, but that wasn't the main lesson. The main lesson was simpler. Miller only changed when he understood the man in cuffs had status and federal backing. He did not change when civilians said Elias had saved lives. He did not change when Elias complied. He changed when he realized the consequences could reach him. That's what exposed him. What would you have done if you were standing there watching it happen? Put it in the comments. Share the story with someone who still thinks accountability never reaches people in uniform. And subscribe for more stories like this.
Stop right there. Put the bags down. The case stays with me. It's classified.
I don't care what you say it is. Put it
You
down.
can verify my
I'm
credentials
not
and call a
authorized to
supervisor.
surrender classified material.
This airport cop thought he was stopping another passenger he could push around for a few minutes. He had no idea the man in front of him was a black military commander carrying classified federal material after being pulled out of a live overseas operation. He saw the uniform, the injuries, the case, and still decided none of it made sense to him. That decision wrecked his career and dragged his department into a federal case. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you like stories where abuse of power gets exposed in public, like and subscribe. This one started with a stop in a crowded airport and ended with prison time. Adrian Cross was moving through Phoenix Sky Harbor on a Sunday evening, trying to make a connection and finish the last part of a military transfer. Less than 72 hours earlier, he had been extracted from hostile territory after a combat mission went bad. Several men had been wounded, command changed his route, and sent him back to the United States under tight security. He looked like a man who had just come out of something serious. He had not slept properly in almost 2 days. His right hand was wrapped from an injury during extraction. A cut near his eyebrow was still healing. Under his arm, he carried a sealed, classified case. Over his shoulder, he had a duffel bag packed in a rush before transport. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't causing any problem. He was walking from one terminal connection to the next. The terminal was full. Delayed passengers were crowded near the gates. Families were coming back from trips. Flight crews were moving between terminals. Announcements kept cutting through the noise. People were checking phones, dragging luggage, and trying to get home. Adrian kept moving through all of it at a steady pace. His uniform was still neat. His face showed the strain. Anyone paying normal attention would have seen an injured officer in transit. Officer Brent Hollis saw something else. Hollis had spent years in airport policing. He also had a reputation, even if the department never dealt with it properly. Black and Latino travelers had filed complaints before. They said he stopped them more often, pushed harder, and treated routine encounters like personal tests. None of that had changed his position. When he saw Adrian, he made a decision before saying a word. In his mind, Adrian did not look like the kind of man who should be traveling alone with high-level military credentials and a sealed case. That was the real reason for the stop. Hollis stepped in front of him near the gate corridor and blocked his path. Foot traffic had to move around them. Then he started questioning him. He wanted to know where Adrian was coming from, what was in the case, why he was injured, and why he was traveling alone. Adrian stayed calm. He gave only the information he was allowed to give. He presented military identification and travel documents. He explained that he was in transit under orders. He also made one point clear right away. The sealed case contained classified military material, and he could not hand it over to civilian law enforcement without proper authorization. That should have settled the next step. A professional officer would verify the credentials through the proper channel and move on. Hollis didn't do that. He looked over Adrian's identification with open suspicion. He turned it over in his hands and studied it like he had already decided it was fake. He did not try to verify it through official channels. He kept talking to Adrian like he had caught him in a lie. Adrian didn't rise to it. He stayed controlled and repeated only what he was authorized to say. When it became clear Hollis was not handling this properly, Adrian asked for a supervisor. That request made the stop worse. Hollis treated it like a challenge. His tone got sharper. He moved closer. He repeated the same questions and kept pushing for the case. Adrian gave him nothing extra. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any sudden move. Then Hollis ordered him to put everything on the ground, including the sealed case. Adrian lowered the duffel bag. He kept hold of the case. Calmly, he repeated that he was not authorized to surrender classified military material. That was a lawful answer. It was also the moment Hollis stopped acting like this was a security check and started turning it into a power play. People nearby had started watching, not because Adrian made a scene, because Hollis did. His voice carried across the gate area. Travelers slowed down. A few stopped completely. Some looked at Adrian's uniform, then at the officer, and could tell the situation was going in the wrong direction. Adrian asked for a supervisor again. Hollis ignored him and repeated the order. Adrian held his position, still calm, still compliant in every way that did not violate military protocol. He had shown identification. He had explained his status. He had not threatened anyone. He had not resisted. None of that mattered to Hollis anymore. At that point, the stop was no longer about security. It was about control. Hollis had decided Adrian was not the man his credentials said he was, and he was going to force the situation until Adrian submitted. That was the last moment before it turned physical. Hollis made the move first. He grabbed Adrian's injured arm and twisted hard. Not a guiding hold, not a standard control move on a resisting suspect. He went straight at the damaged arm of a man who had been standing still, speaking clearly, and asking for a supervisor. Adrian lost balance immediately. His shoulder hit the floor first, then his knees, then the side of his face. The bandaging on his hand tore open. The cut near his eyebrow split again on impact. The sealed case came loose and slid several feet across the polished tile toward a waiting area full of passengers. That changed the scene instantly. A few seconds earlier, people had seen a tense stop. Now they were watching an injured, uniformed commander bleeding on an airport floor, while an officer yelled at him to stay down even though he had not rushed anyone, swung at anyone, or tried to run. A second officer moved in and helped pin him instead of stopping it. That made it worse. Adrian kept saying he was not resisting. He said it clearly. He said it while face down. He said it while one arm was pinned and the other was already injured. He did not threaten them. He did not curse them out. He did not try to turn the struggle into some loud scene. He kept trying to state the obvious facts while they kept forcing him lower. People around them started reacting all at once. Some froze, some backed away. Some started shouting that he was not doing anything. Others pulled out their phones and began recording. That part mattered because once multiple angles hit the internet later, the department lost any chance to hide behind a vague incident report. And the Bodycam made it even worse for Hollis. It captured the full sequence: the questioning, the ignored credentials, the request for a supervisor, the refusal to verify anything properly, the order to surrender the sealed case, then the takedown. Anyone reviewing that footage could see the gap between Adrian's behavior and Hollis's response. There was no real threat to explain it away. The sealed case sitting exposed on the terminal floor turned this from misconduct into something much bigger. That case was not supposed to be out in public like that. Not in the middle of a crowded airport corridor. Not within sight of random travelers holding up phones. Not after a civilian officer had forced it out of the hands of the person assigned to move it. Nobody around that scene knew what was in it. That was the point. They were not supposed to know. But now airport police had created a public security problem where there had been none. Hollis still acted like he was in control. That's what reckless officers do when they realize too late that they've gone too far. They double down and hope force will cover the mistake. He kept shouting commands at Adrian as if noise could justify what the footage was already showing. It couldn't. Passengers had gathered far enough back to avoid getting dragged in, but close enough to see everything clearly. Some were yelling for the officers to stop. One man kept saying Adrian had already shown ID. A woman near the gate seating said they were hurting an injured serviceman for no reason. A flight crew member stood off to the side and watched the sealed case with the kind of expression people get when they know something is deeply wrong, even if they do not know the exact rules being broken. Then Sergeant Lena Mercer arrived. She did not need a full briefing. One look told her enough. She saw Adrian on the floor in cuffs, bleeding through reopened injuries. She saw his military identification being treated like it meant nothing. She saw the sealed case separated from him in a public terminal. She saw passengers recording. She saw the second officer helping hold down a man who was clearly under control already. Mercer understood the scale of the mistake immediately. This was no longer a local airport stop. This was a wounded military commander in uniform, in transit under orders, handled with force in public, while carrying classified federal material. That alone was catastrophic. Add Bodycam, civilian recordings, and a terminal full of witnesses. And now the whole thing was already bigger than the department. Mercer stepped in fast and took over. She ordered the officers to remove the handcuffs. She secured the sealed case herself instead of leaving it exposed. She demanded Adrian's credentials back. She called Airport Command and started locking the scene down before anyone could keep freelancing and make it worse. Hollis tried to hold onto the stop for a few more seconds. Officers like him always do. He started framing it as a suspicious encounter, tried to justify the force, and pushed the idea that Adrian had failed to comply. Mercer shut that down. The facts were too visible. Adrian had produced valid military identification. He had explained the limits of his authority over the case. He had asked for a supervisor. He had lowered the duffel bag when ordered. He had not made any threatening move. The public had seen all of that. The cameras had seen all of that. Hollis was standing inside his own problem with no room left to reshape it. Adrian was helped back to his feet. By then, blood was visible on the floor where he had hit. His hand wrapping had come apart. The cut near his eyebrow was open again. He looked like a man who had just survived one extraction overseas and then got slammed onto an airport floor back home by people who could not accept what his credentials already proved. Mercer got medical support moving, but she also had another crisis on her hands. The case had to be secured. The chain around it had to be documented. Every second after that takedown created more questions. Who had touched it? Who had been close to it? What had been visible? What had been recorded? Which officers had handled material they had no authority to handle? That is where local control started ending. Airport Command got pulled in. Then military contacts. Then federal personnel. Fast. This wasn't because Adrian was important in some vague, symbolic way. It was because the stop triggered 3 separate disasters at once. A civil rights problem, an assault problem, a classified material problem. Once the right people were notified, the tone changed immediately. Nobody from the military side treated this like a misunderstanding. Nobody from the federal side saw it as a routine use of force question. The facts were too bad, too clear, and too well recorded. And Hollis had another problem coming that he still didn't fully understand. This was not going to stay inside the airport. Passengers were already uploading clips before supervisors finished their first calls. The footage showed enough to spark outrage on its own. A black officer in uniform, visibly injured, pinned to the ground while saying he was not resisting. Once people learned he was a military commander carrying classified material under orders, the story was going to hit a much harder level. By the end of that night, the department was no longer asking how to explain the incident. It was asking how much video was out there, how many prior complaints were now going to come back, and whether Brent Hollis had just exposed years of things they had chosen not to deal with. The story got out before the department could control it. By that night, passenger videos were already moving across social media. People did not need a long explanation to understand what they were looking at. A black officer in uniform, visibly injured, was taken down in a crowded airport while saying he was not resisting. That alone was bad enough. Then more details came out. He was not just any service member. He was Commander Adrian Cross. He had just returned from an overseas combat operation. He was carrying classified material under orders when airport police put him on the floor and let that case slide across a public terminal. After that, the department lost the story. Bodycam footage made it worse. It backed up the main facts instead of helping the officers. It showed Adrian presenting valid military identification. It showed him staying calm. It showed him asking for a supervisor. It showed Hollis pushing past all of that and turning a controlled stop into a forced takedown. Once investigators saw the footage, there was no serious way to frame this as confusion. Military authorities moved fast. Federal investigators did too. They were not just looking at the assault. They were looking at the exposure of classified material, the failure to verify federal credentials, and the fact that a civilian airport officer had overridden basic procedure because he did not believe the person in front of him. That point stayed at the center of everything. Hollis had not uncovered a fake officer. He had ignored a real one. That made the case cleaner for prosecutors later because it stripped away the usual excuses. This was not a fast-moving fight, not a bad split-second read, not a crowded scene misfire. He had time to look at the identification, time to call it in, time to get a supervisor, time to slow down. He chose none of that. And once the case got attention, older stories started coming back. Black travelers, Latino travelers. Men stopped near gates. Families questioned too aggressively. Passengers who said Hollis acted like ordinary movement through the airport was suspicious when the wrong people were doing it. Some had filed complaints and heard nothing back. Some never filed because they assumed nothing would happen. Some came forward only after seeing Adrian's case and realizing this officer had been doing the same thing for years. That opened the next problem. Investigators pulled internal records, complaint logs, email traffic, shift notes, prior review summaries. What they found was ugly, but not surprising. Hollis had not been some unknown risk hidden deep inside the system. Supervisors had known he generated repeated complaints tied to race. They had known he escalated ordinary encounters. They had known his stops were not affecting all travelers the same way. He stayed in position anyway. Why? Because on paper, he looked productive. He made stops. He wrote reports. He created numbers management could point to. That matters in bad departments more than judgment ever does. A reckless officer who fills spreadsheets often gets protected longer than a careful one who avoids bad stops in the first place. So this stopped being one-man misconduct. It turned into a department case. Federal investigators started asking why earlier complaints had gone nowhere, why no one had corrected the pattern, why someone with that history remained in a public-facing airport role. Internal leadership had weak answers because there were no good ones. The deeper the review went, the clearer it became that Hollis had been allowed to operate this way, because the system around him tolerated it. Adrian stayed disciplined through all of it. He got medical treatment. His hand had to be rewrapped. The reopened cut near his eyebrow was documented along with bruising from the takedown. He gave his statement carefully and through the right channels. He did not overstate anything. He did not need to. The footage did the work. The witnesses did the work. The records did the work. That helped him. People trust the person who keeps the facts straight while everyone else starts scrambling. Adrian did that from the beginning. Same tone in the terminal. Same tone after. He said what happened, what he had shown, what he had refused, and why. No extra drama. No performance. Just a clean record against a dirty one. The public response kept building. Veterans groups spoke up. Civil rights attorneys spoke up. Former travelers who had dealt with Hollis started sharing their own stories publicly. Local reporters started pulling complaint histories and asking questions the department had avoided for years. Once that happened, airport leadership could not hide behind internal review language anymore. The issue was out in the open and widening. And Hollis was done, whether he understood it yet or not. He was pulled from duty first, then suspended, then formally fired once the early reviews and footage lined up. Losing the badge was only the start. The criminal side was moving too. Federal prosecutors were already looking at the assault, the civil rights angle, and the misuse of authority under color of law. That combination was serious, because now the government was not just saying he handled a stop badly. It was saying he used official power to unlawfully target, detain, and assault someone who had done nothing to justify it. That is a different level of case. Harder to explain away. Harder to defend in front of a jury. The classified case made it even worse for him. He had no authority to demand it the way he did. No authority to force that transfer in the middle of a terminal. No authority to create the security risk that followed. Once federal personnel mapped out the chain of events, that became another piece of proof that Hollis was not acting carefully or lawfully. He was forcing compliance first and thinking later. That works until cameras are rolling and the victim's paperwork is real. Then everything flips. By that point, the airport department was no longer dealing with one scandal. It was dealing with three at once. A public civil rights scandal, a federal criminal case, an internal exposure problem involving years of ignored warning signs. Leadership started making defensive statements, but they sounded hollow because the facts were already ahead of them. The footage had pinned them down, and the longer the review went, the clearer it became that Adrian Cross had walked into that terminal, carrying classified material from a dangerous mission, only to run into the one kind of threat he should not have had to deal with back home. An officer who thought his own bias outranked the credentials in his hand. Once the federal case moved forward, Hollis was finished. The video showed Adrian presenting valid military ID, staying calm, asking for a supervisor, and refusing only one thing: handing over classified material without authorization. That was legal. Hollis ignored all of it and used force anyway. Prosecutors built the case around that choice. They showed he had time to verify the credentials and chose not to. He had time to call a supervisor and refused. He treated Adrian like a liar because he did not believe a black man in front of him could actually hold that level of military authority. Then the old complaints came back. Black and Latino travelers described the same pattern: aggressive stops, humiliation, suspicion with no real basis. Internal records showed supervisors already knew Hollis had a history and kept him in that airport role anyway. That hurt the department badly. Now it was no longer one bad stop. It was a pattern they had protected. Hollis was fired, lost his badge, and was prosecuted in federal court. The Bodycam, passenger videos, witness statements, and prior complaints left him little room. He was convicted on charges tied to unlawful assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. He was sent to prison for several years. Adrian was fully cleared and backed by the official record. His injuries were documented. His account matched the footage. Military leadership confirmed he had acted within protocol the whole time. There was also a large civil settlement. The department had to change procedures after that. Complaint reviews were tightened. Body cam audits increased. Officers with repeated bias complaints got closer scrutiny. Leadership was forced to answer for why Hollis had been left in place for so long. That is what made this case bigger than one officer. Hollis thought he was stopping someone he could pressure without consequences. Instead, he picked a military commander with valid credentials, a clean record, witnesses, body cam footage, and a chain of command that reached...
Set the case down, now, and show me your ID again.
I already showed you I'm FBI. That case is classified. You need a supervisor and proper verification.
You need to do what I'm telling you.
I'm not fighting you. I'm telling you you can't take federal classified material.
This airport officer thought he was stopping an ordinary traveler he could question in public and control on the spot. But he had no idea the man in front of him was Special Agent Jordan Hayes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, moving classified material through Dallas-Fort Worth after being pulled out of an overseas counterterrorism operation. He saw the credentials and still treated the whole thing like an act. He heard the warning about classified federal property and kept pushing anyway. That decision turned a gate corridor stop into an assault on a federal agent, a public exposure of sensitive material, and the incident that finally brought years of buried complaints back to the surface. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you follow stories about profiling, abuse of authority, and real consequences when somebody in uniform goes too far, like the video, and subscribe. Jordan Hayes had almost nothing left in the tank when Officer Tyler Grayson stopped him inside a crowded connection area at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Jordan had been pulled out of a dangerous overseas operation with almost no notice. He had spent close to 2 days awake. His hand was wrapped from an injury during extraction. He was carrying a sealed classified case that had to reach cleared federal personnel without delay. He was not looking for help, conversation, or attention. He was moving from one terminal connection to the next and trying to finish the last piece of an operation that nobody around him was cleared to understand. There was nothing dramatic about the way he moved through the terminal. He kept his pace steady. He stayed focused on the route ahead. He did not stop to argue with staff or draw attention to himself. To most people nearby, he was just another exhausted traveler trying to make a connection. Grayson saw something else. He noticed the hard case first, then the credentials, then Jordan himself. A black man, tired, injured, carrying federal identification, and moving like he expected not to be interrupted. Grayson did not take that as a sign to verify carefully. He took it as something he did not believe. That was the real reason for the stop. He stepped into Jordan's path, near the gate corridor, and forced the encounter in front of passing travelers. From the start, his tone was aggressive. He did not approach like a man trying to sort out a concern. He approached like a man who had already decided he had caught somebody pretending to be more important than he was. Jordan answered him directly. He identified himself as a federal agent. He presented credentials. He explained that he was in transit on official business, and that the sealed case contained classified material. He also made clear that the case could not be opened or surrendered without proper authorization. That should have moved the situation into verification through command. Grayson did not do that. He looked at the credentials and treated them like something fake until proven real. He kept pressing Jordan in the same hostile tone. He questioned him as if the credentials were a prop, and the case was something he had the right to take just because he demanded it. He was not trying to solve a problem. He was trying to force compliance in public. Jordan did not match that energy. He stayed controlled. He repeated the same point in plain terms. The case was classified. There was a process for verification. Grayson did not have authority to take federal material because he felt suspicious. That answer bothered Grayson more than anything else. A man like that can handle uncertainty better than refusal. Once Jordan made it clear that he was not handing over the case without proper authority, Grayson stopped acting like this was about airport security and started acting like it was about his pride. He moved closer. He raised the pressure. People nearby started noticing the stop because Grayson was making it impossible not to notice. Travelers slowed down. Some kept walking and looked back. Others stayed near the seating area and watched. The whole thing could still have been contained with one smart decision. Call a supervisor, run the verification the right way, keep the scene quiet. Grayson chose the opposite. A second officer came over and joined him. He did not calm things down. He backed Grayson and added to the pressure. That made the scene worse, because Jordan was now dealing with two local officers who had decided that force mattered more than procedure. Jordan stayed where he was. He kept his movements limited. He repeated his identity and told them again that the case involved classified federal material. He did not threaten them. He did not insult them. He did not argue beyond the boundary that mattered. He was not surrendering the case without lawful authorization. Grayson took that as a challenge. The takedown started when he grabbed Jordan's injured arm. There was no legal reason for it. Jordan had not tried to run. He had not pushed past anyone. He had not reached for the officers. He had not made any threatening move. Grayson grabbed the one arm he knew was already damaged and used it to force Jordan down onto the terminal floor. The second officer assisted instead of stopping it. Passengers stopped in full view of the scene. Some shouted that Jordan was not resisting. Others pulled out their phones and started recording. The terminal went from normal airport noise to that specific kind of public disturbance that happens when people realize an officer is going too far and nobody around him is correcting it. Jordan hit the floor hard. The wound in his wrapped hand reopened. Blood showed on the tile. The sealed case slid across the polished floor and came to a stop near a waiting area, out in the open where strangers could see it. That was the point where the stop became a security failure, on top of everything else. Grayson had claimed the stop was about control and safety, but his actions had done the opposite. He had injured a federal agent, exposed a sealed, classified case in a crowded terminal, and created the exact public scene a competent officer would have avoided from the start. Jordan still did not fight. That mattered later because every camera caught the same basic truth. He was not resisting. He was pinned down while identifying himself and warning them that they were mishandling classified federal material. He was trying to protect the case and stop the situation from getting even worse. Grayson kept issuing commands anyway, trying to make the takedown sound justified after the fact. It did not work. Too many people were close enough to see how it actually began. Too many phones were already recording. Then the body camera captured the part that changed the entire case. During the detention, Grayson said enough to make his thinking obvious. He made it clear that he did not believe Jordan was really a federal agent. Not because the credentials had failed verification, not because Jordan had contradicted himself. He did not believe him because he had already decided that the man in front of him did not fit the role he claimed to hold. That stripped away every excuse. Once that came out, nobody could seriously frame this as a misunderstanding between agencies. It was a profiling stop that turned into a public use of force incident because one officer refused to accept that a black man in front of him had real federal authority. Jordan stayed focused on the same thing the whole time. He kept identifying himself. He kept warning them about the case. He kept his attention on limiting damage. That discipline ended up mattering because the scene was seconds away from moving out of local control. The first person on site who understood the scale of the problem was Sergeant Monica Vale. When she arrived, she did not need a long explanation. She saw Jordan bleeding on the floor in restraints. She saw federal credentials that had already been presented and ignored. She saw the sealed case separated from his control in the middle of a public terminal. She saw travelers recording from multiple angles. She heard enough of the exchange to know this was not a routine airport stop that had gone messy. It was already a departmental disaster with federal consequences. Vale reacted fast because she knew delay would make it worse. She read the scene for what it was. A local officer had detained a federal agent, used force without a valid threat, and exposed classified material in public. At that point, the question was no longer whether Grayson had made a bad call. The question was how much damage had already been done before command could shut it down. Sergeant Monica Vale understood the problem as soon as she reached the scene. She saw Jordan Hayes on the floor in restraints, bleeding from the hand. She saw federal credentials already out. She saw the sealed case separated from him in a public terminal. She saw passengers recording. That was enough. She stopped listening to Tyler Grayson's tone and started looking at facts. Jordan identified himself again. He told her he was Federal Bureau of Investigation in transit on official business, and carrying classified material. He told her the case had to stay protected until cleared federal personnel took custody. He did not over-explain. He did not argue. He stayed focused on the same point he had been making from the start. Vale ordered the cuffs removed. That changed the whole scene immediately. Grayson had been treating Jordan like a suspect he could dominate in public. Vale treated him like what he actually was, a federal agent whose authority had been ignored and whose mission had been disrupted. She then secured the area around the case and called Airport Command. Her questions were direct. When were the credentials shown? Why was force used? Who touched the case? Why was a man identifying himself as federal on the floor instead of being verified through command? Grayson tried to say Jordan had been suspicious and uncooperative. That explanation did not hold up. The credentials were real. Witnesses were already saying Jordan had not resisted. The case had been identified as classified before the takedown. The body cameras were running. Too many facts were already fixed. Medical personnel arrived and checked Jordan's hand. The wound had reopened during the takedown. Blood was still visible on the floor. Even then, Jordan stayed focused on the transfer. He made clear that the detention had interrupted a live federal chain and that the delay itself was now part of the damage. Airport Command arrived within minutes. Once Command understood that local officers had detained a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent carrying classified material, the matter stopped being a routine use of force review. It became a command-level emergency. The questions changed immediately. They wanted body camera status, witness footage, timestamps, and confirmation of when Jordan first identified himself. The answers were bad. Jordan had identified himself early. He had shown credentials. He had warned them about the case. Grayson still escalated. Force was used anyway. The case ended up exposed in public view. Civilian footage was already spreading online. Federal personnel arrived fast after that. That speed said everything. They were not responding to a minor airport dispute. They were responding to an assault on a federal agent and a public mishandling of classified material. Jordan was moved to a controlled area. His identity was verified through the channels Grayson should have used from the start. The result matched everything Jordan had said. He was Special Agent Jordan Hayes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was in lawful custody of the case. He was moving under active federal authority. That ended the factual dispute. From that point on, the issue was Grayson's conduct. He had ignored valid credentials, treated a federal warning like a bluff, used force without a real threat, and created a public security breach in one of the busiest airports in the country. Command pulled Grayson off the scene. The second officer was also separated. Their body cameras were flagged for review. Their reports were no longer just paperwork. They were evidence. Jordan finally got what he should have gotten at the beginning: medical treatment, command recognition, and a direct path to complete the transfer. The department by then had a different problem. Video of the takedown was already online. First short clips, then longer angles, then audio clear enough to show that Jordan had identified himself, and Grayson had ignored it. Once those videos started spreading, the department lost the ability to describe it as a routine security stop. Federal supervisors looked at it even harder. One of their agents had been injured. Classified material had been exposed in public. The stop had no solid legal basis. The body camera captured language that pointed to profiling. That moved the case beyond a bad arrest. It became a civil rights issue, an abuse of authority case, and a possible criminal matter. By the end of that first response, Grayson was no longer just an officer in a viral airport clip. He was the reason federal investigators were now looking at the entire department. Once federal investigators reviewed the body camera footage, the case changed fast. At first, the airport police department tried the usual language: They described the stop as a security response in a busy terminal. They suggested the situation developed quickly. They implied the officers were reacting to uncertainty. The footage cut through that almost immediately. Jordan Hayes identified himself early. He presented credentials. He warned Tyler Grayson that the case contained classified federal material and could not be taken without proper authorization. None of that was missing from the record. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was that Grayson chose not to accept it. That detail mattered more than anything else. A mistaken stop can sometimes be defended if an officer corrects course once facts are clear. Grayson did the opposite. The clearer Jordan was, the more aggressive Grayson became. That made the review much worse for him, because investigators were not looking at a split-second judgment anymore. They were looking at a sequence: questioning, refusal to verify properly, escalation, force, public exposure of the case, injury, all after valid federal identification had already been shown. Then investigators reached the body camera audio that destroyed the department's safest defense. Grayson said enough during the detention to show that he did not reject Jordan's claim because of a failed check or some concrete contradiction. He rejected it because he did not believe a man like Jordan should have that kind of authority in the first place. He did not say it in some polished official language. He said it the way people do when their real thinking slips out under pressure. That moved the case directly into civil rights territory. Now, the issue was not just unlawful force. It was profiling tied to authority. Jordan was not stopped because of what he did. He was stopped because Grayson decided that his presence, his credentials, and his quiet certainty did not fit the role he claimed to hold. Once that became clear, the stop stopped looking questionable and started looking deliberate. Federal supervisors made that point very clear behind the scenes, and then in a more careful form in their formal communications. They were not treating this as a misunderstanding between agencies. They were treating it as an assault on a federal agent, interference with federal duty, mishandling of classified material, and a possible deprivation of rights case. That language put real pressure on the airport police department because a local use of force problem can sometimes be absorbed internally. A federal civil rights and authority abuse case cannot. The public videos kept spreading while all of this was happening. That made things worse for the department because every new clip added context. One angle showed the takedown more clearly. Another picked up the case, sliding across the floor. Another caught bystanders saying Jordan was not resisting. One of the longer videos made the timing especially damaging. People could hear Jordan identifying himself before the force happened, not after. That eliminated another possible excuse. The department could no longer claim the officers only learned who he was once he was already on the ground. The sequence was out there. So was the blood on the floor. So was the image of a sealed case sitting away from its lawful custodian, while airport police stood around it in public. By that point, the story had moved beyond local news. Federal law enforcement circles were talking about it. Civil rights attorneys were talking about it. Former airport travelers who recognized Grayson from their own encounters started paying attention. That is when an incident stops being one event and starts pulling history behind it. Internal affairs had to open a full review, but the department did not control the pace anymore. Federal investigators wanted every relevant piece of evidence: full body camera footage, dispatch logs, timestamps, radio traffic, training records, prior complaints, use of force history, supervisory notes. They were not just asking what Grayson did that day. They were asking whether the department already knew he had a pattern. That question scared people more than the video. A bad officer is one problem. A bad officer kept in place after repeated warning signs is a bigger one. Departments can isolate the first if they move quickly. The second points upward. That is why old complaints started resurfacing almost immediately. Black and Latino travelers who had filed complaints against Grayson in earlier years, began contacting reporters and lawyers. Some said he had stopped them in terminals without a clear reason. Some said he had treated valid identification like it was fake. Some described the same pattern Jordan had faced: aggressive tone first, suspicion without facts, then pressure to submit in public. Not every old complaint had video. Most of these cases never do. But now people were looking at them differently because Jordan's case gave those older reports a visible structure. The pattern was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, body camera audio, civilian footage, and a federal victim the department could not dismiss. Former victims started speaking publicly. That was the point where the department's exposure widened. It was no longer only about what Grayson did to Jordan Hayes in one airport corridor. It was about how many times Grayson had done some version of it to people with less power, less documentation, and less chance of being believed. Jordan survived the stop with federal backing and a command structure behind him. Most travelers Grayson had targeted before did not have that. That comparison hit hard. It also made Jordan's role in the story bigger than his own case. He was still the victim of the stop, but now his case was also the event that forced a buried record into the open. Then the internal emails started getting attention. Those messages did not show some dramatic conspiracy. Real institutional failure is usually more ordinary than that. What they showed was enough. Supervisors had discussed complaints about Grayson over the years. Some had flagged concerns about his approach with minority travelers. Some had noted that his stops created repeated friction and unnecessary escalation. But he kept a public-facing airport assignment anyway, because he generated high stop numbers and looked productive on paper. That kind of record is poison once it becomes public. It means the department did not just fail to spot a problem. It saw enough to worry and still protected the officer because his numbers made management look active. It means complaints were not ignored by accident. They were absorbed as the cost of keeping a certain style of policing in place. That is where the case stopped being only about Tyler Grayson. Now the focus was shifting to the people who kept him there: supervisors, command staff, internal review processes, complaint screening, assignment decisions. Every layer that had looked at warning signs and decided they were manageable. Jordan, through all of this, still completed the transfer that day. That detail stayed important in every later account because it showed how much discipline he had maintained under pressure. He had been injured, detained, humiliated in public, and delayed during a sensitive federal movement. Even so, he stayed focused long enough to complete the mission before turning fully to the fallout. That gave the case another sharp contrast. The man treated like a threat acted with control the whole way through. The officer claiming to protect the airport was the one who created the actual breach. By the end of that stage, the department was facing pressure from every direction at once. Federal investigators, civil rights review, public outrage, media scrutiny, reopened complaints, internal emails, witness footage, body camera evidence. The stop in the terminal was over. The real collapse had started after it. The ending came fast once the records opened up. Tyler Grayson was removed from duty, then terminated. The second officer was suspended and later disciplined for assisting in the takedown instead of stopping it. Federal investigators kept the bigger case moving because this was not just about policy violations. They were reviewing civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and the handling of classified material during an unlawful detention. The department tried to isolate Grayson at first. That did not work. Old complaints from Black and Latino travelers were reopened. Former victims spoke publicly. Their stories sounded too similar to dismiss. Same aggressive tone, same disbelief, same habit of treating ordinary people of color like they had to prove they belonged in spaces where Grayson thought they did not fit. Then the internal emails became the real problem. Supervisors had known for years that Grayson generated repeated complaints. They had discussed his conduct. They had flagged concerns. He still stayed in a public-facing airport role because his stop numbers made him look productive. That shifted blame upward. The story was no longer about one reckless officer. It was about a department that tolerated him because the paperwork looked good. That brought outside pressure. Civil rights lawyers got involved. Federal review widened. Airport leadership had to answer for complaint handling, use of force oversight, and assignment decisions. The department was pushed into changing procedures for credential verification, supervisor response, and public contact review. Body camera audits were expanded, complaint files were re-examined, several supervisors were reassigned or forced out. Jordan Hayes finished the federal transfer the same day he was detained. After that, he gave his formal statement and let the evidence speak. He did not need to build the case with emotion. The video, the body camera, the witness accounts, and the department's own records already did that. What happened to him was serious on its own. What made it bigger was what it exposed. Grayson did this to the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and for once the system could not pretend it was an isolated mistake. Jordan had federal backing, documentation, witnesses, and chain of command support. Other people Grayson targeted before did not. That is why the case mattered beyond one airport stop. The lesson was simple. A badge does not turn bias into judgment. It just makes the damage larger when nobody stops it. What would you have done if you saw that happen in front of you? Have you ever watched somebody in authority push too far because they thought nobody would challenge them? Put it in the comments. Share the story with somebody who would understand it.